Good morning, good morning, good morning. Today we're going to talk about what stories are. What even is a story? We know what a story is, of course, when we see one, but could you define what a story is? What's the difference between a story and a narrative? And what happens up here that makes stories so important in our lives? This is the only theoretical lecture, purely theoretical, in this whole series, and I think it's probably the longest by some way, but do stick with it, hang in there. I promise it's of great value to you as a writer, and before you know it, we'll be catching up with Professor Moose here, who's going to help us get into the more easygoing material. Until then, you can tell all your friends that you're studying neuroscience, so let's crack on with some definitions, beginning with the terms story and narrative and their relationship with how the mind works. Okay, so from the very first breath of a newborn child, and for all human beings throughout all history, throughout evolution, we exist and we evolve in an environment of constant change, okay? It defines us. The planet spins, the sun comes up, the sun goes down, it gets warm, it gets cold, the tide comes in, the tide goes out, it gets dark, it gets light, and all of life, as we know and experience it, spun up in this context of constant change over time. And there's a word for change over time. You know what that word is? Well, when you have a logical sequence of connected change over time, this is called a narrative. And it's happening to us and around us continuously, everywhere and at all times. A spider spinning a web somewhere, a pride of lions are chasing down a zebra, a moon is turning round a planet somewhere, some kids are playing football in a park, someone's catching a train, some parents are cooking a meal, right? You get the idea. It's all narrative and it's happening all the time. It defines us, irrespective of whether human beings are here or not. That's the environment, and human beings arrived here, okay? It's bigger than us, and it defines the environment in which we exist. However, we've become the alpha creature on this planet because we are the very best at working with narrative, at figuring it out. We can identify and understand all these narratives from all across nature, and we hold them in mind in a special form of memory concerned with what the narrative means to us in human cultural terms. This is called an autobiographical narrative memory, or to give it its more common term, it's called a story. A narrative interpreted into mind is called a story. So, narrative is out there, it's everywhere, and it's continuous, but there are no stories out there in the world. There's just change over time. When a narrative is experienced by a human being, it's interpreted into mind and stored in a more meaningful form, giving it human meaning, and that's called a story. Okay? If you think about it, knowledge primarily only exists in a narrative context. Until something shows what it does within a narrative progression, it doesn't have any meaning to us as human beings. And what do I mean by that? Well, imagine a fishing net here on the quay, right? And you're a 1-year-old, or you're an alien that's just dropped out of space, right? It's a pile of string, right? It's a fishing net to you and I because we have a label for it, but it doesn't mean anything when it's just sat there, okay? It has to do something within the context of a narrative, right? Okay, so we hang it on the back of a boat, it goes out into the water, right? And you drag it along behind a boat and you can catch things from under the water and pull them back onto the shore. Aha, now we get it, right? A fishing net drags stuff out of the sea and we can use it. Okay, so that's what it does in a narrative context. But then on top of that, we have what it means to a human being. Okay, and when you get home in the evening, there on the table, a nice fish dinner. Aha, nourishment, sustenance, survival. That's what it means, okay, deep inside a human being. And all items have this context. What it is, the label we give it, what it does in a narrative context, and what it means when it does that thing. What's the outcome? Is it a beneficial outcome? Is it a negative outcome? Okay? Now, we're going to return to our fishing net in the future, but get this. There is no knowledge or meaning out there in the world. Okay? There's just narrative. There's just change over time. Knowledge is only ever in here. Okay, here in mind. There's no knowledge out there. There's no knowledge in the hedgerows. There's no knowledge in the fields. There's no knowledge out there at all. There's just change over time, and then there's what we think about it. However, when we experience a narrative progression, when we're part of it or we observe one and we pull it into mind and interpret it into human cultural sense, this is called learning. So a narrative interpreted into mind through human experience is knowledge. Now, there's no knowledge out there, there's just stuff that happens, and there's no stories out there, that's just narrative. Now, you might be doubting this, and obviously it's I'm trying to condense some fairly heavy-duty material into a manageable form, but let me show you how important this is, okay? If you think about it, your life is made of narratives. Psychologists call these scripts, and you are in the middle of dozens of these kinds of scripts that define your life right now. From simple ones you perform, making a cup of tea, having a shower, eating in a restaurant, catching a train, the script you run for the Christmas holidays or for Halloween, we all know how to do that, right? Undergoing a medical procedure, that's a narrative process, managing a relationship, going to school or college, bringing up children, growing some vegetables, managing a career, right? All of these things in small, medium and large are narrative progressions that we manage to try and get the beneficial outcome. Okay, you're in the middle of a script now to learn about story to get you the beneficial outcome in your desire to be a writer. Okay, storytelling is not something we just happen to do. It's something we virtually have to do if we want to remember anything. Okay, so memories are stories and stories are memories. The stories we create are the memories we have, and the memories we have are the stories we tell. And then we use our intelligence to mix and match these things, that kind of lateral thinking we call it, to create new ones. So we're all running dozens of these scripts at any one time. Scripts replace thinking. The thinking people do is to decide which script to apply, and we can run these scripts on autopilot. Now, when you were a kid, do you remember catching a train? It was super exciting, right? Or your first day at school. Just so emotional, so exciting. Why? Because you were learning a new narrative. Once it's learned and it's bedded in, you're simply running that script from your autobiographical memory. It's no longer triggering you emotionally, right? You're not having to think, you're just deciding which script to apply. Okay, your 50th commute to work is not exciting, and you don't have to fire up your higher intelligence to run that narrative, and you're not learning anything new. Okay, the act of learning is to absorb and understand or to invent and create a new narrative progression. Okay, it doesn't have to be the truth. There's plenty of things we learn and we accept and we know to be true, forms of truth, because they make narrative sense. Think about the Tooth Fairy and Father Christmas, the religions you don't believe in, right? They're all stories and they're all narrative progressions that make sense. So the act of existing is to run a selected set of narrative progressions that will take you to the outcomes you desire. Now, people will say, no, surely learning is not always a narrative. If I learn a set of names and the dates of the royal family going back through history, that's learning and it's not a narrative, right? Well, yes, but let me give you an example of why this is not quite the same as learning through narrative. If I show you 20 items on a tray, right, and ask you to memorise them, right, here you go, have 30 seconds to take a look at these 20 items, and then I hide it away behind my back, right, it's really hard to remember those 20 items on the tray, right? Very difficult indeed. And yet, if someone tells you the story of Little Red Riding Hood when you're 4 years old, bang, in it goes, and you remember it forever. Why? Because it's a narrative progression, a cause-effect chain that makes logical sense and leads to an outcome. And get this, as soon as a narrative makes sense, you cannot help but lay down a memory. It's automatic. You're going to discover later how a well-crafted story can be used to give someone a memory they didn't necessarily want and they didn't necessarily invite in. This is how propaganda and marketing and these kinds of insidious things can be used, and I'm going to show you how to do that. In fact, I'm going to give you a memory you didn't want in the next lecture. Don't worry, it won't hurt, and it's not marketing or propaganda, all harmless, I promise. So, when a child receives the story of Little Red Riding Hood, they automatically lay down a memory as soon as the narrative completes. You can't help it. It's called storification. And that's the meaning of the narrative over and above what the words say. There's the words on the page. You don't memorise those words. You lay down an autobiographical narrative memory for what happened and what it means. Okay? So you walk away with the idea that young children shouldn't speak to strangers, okay? That's the storification. And your brain does it for you, automatically, because the narrative made human, logical sense. And because it makes logical narrative sense, boom, your brain yums it up. It goes in and it sticks. And because we have linguistics, we can deliver narrative memories using just media, sounds and lights and words and symbols. And that memory, the one wrapped in a fictional story and delivered by media, gets bedded down as a memory just as readily and powerfully as any life truth. So hopefully you can see that working with narrative progressions is critical to how we function as human beings, indeed how the earth functions as a living environment. We're far from being the strongest creature in the jungle or the quickest or the best tooled up to defend ourselves, but because we can see narratives unfolding, we can defend ourselves by effectively predicting the future by understanding narrative outcomes, embracing the narratives that give us a positive outcome and changing or avoiding those narratives that have a negative outcome. Must seem like magic to the other creatures we share the world with. And here's the thing for writers, okay? Follow me carefully here because we're getting somewhere now. Because we rely so heavily on understanding narrative for our survival and our dominance, we are highly sensitive to gaps in an unfolding narrative. Okay? Our brains are on an absolute hair trigger to sense when there is a narrative underway that's incomplete or has gone wrong in some way. A narrative that has gaps in it, either because it's new to us or because there's something missing. As soon as there's a gap in a narrative, we become aroused, our brains switch on, we become emotional. We become anxious, and we cannot settle our brains back down until we've filled that gap and satisfied ourselves that we have narrative truth, right? Imagine how you feel when you wake up in the middle of the night, 2:38 a.m, because there's a crash downstairs. The classic bump in the night, right? What the hell was that? You have a narrative progression unfolding in your life downstairs, but it's incomplete. You don't have a full picture. There are gaps in the narrative, so your brain fires up and you're now frantically trying to fill that gap by projecting knowledge from your own life and experience into that gap to have it make sense. You're anxious and you're emotional. You can't just say, whatever, and go back to sleep, right? You can't do that. A gap in a narrative progression is a visceral sign of risk, of danger, possibly opportunity, of excitement, okay? Of a need to protect yourself and take action. Now, I'm going to go into this further, the whole bump in the night scenario. We're going to go deeper into this in the next lecture where we compare it to other story forms. So I won't get ahead of myself now, but I'm sure you can see the point. As soon as there's a gap in knowledge, you go into a state of learning. And we are so attuned to this, and we are so expert at projecting into those gaps and creating new narratives, or finding ways to fix an existing narrative in order to get the outcomes we want. This is what defines us as the most intelligent creature on the planet. Now, this deeply embedded evolutionary sensitivity to gaps in knowledge is exactly the tool of the expert writer. If you leave a gap in a narration, okay, a fictional story you've made up, that gap has exactly the same impact on the receiver's mind as a gap in a real life narrative. It fires your audience up, turns their brains on, they activate their emotional selves, and they can't relax and they can't settle their minds until that gap is filled. And that, right there, is the craft of excellent storytelling. Creating and working with knowledge gaps in narratives is precisely the tool and the craft of the great writers. And it's this that we're going to work with in these lectures. So in the next lecture, I'm going to show you how you can work with knowledge gaps and how that work creates the conditions for the most important tool in the storyteller's box, a magical thing called subtext. Okay, so let's summarise our definitions, okay? A narrative is any form of change over time. It's as simple as that. And here's a definition of story for you as a writer. A story is any form of information transfer which involves knowledge gaps in the delivery. Okay, and again, we'll be looking at these a little more deeply coming soon. Now, as soon as you have a knowledge gap, you have engagement, and I'm going to show you how to use knowledge gaps so your audience is doing all the work, frantically filling those knowledge gaps. And as receivers, we just love to do this. You create the conditions for subtext, and the receiver, your audience, fills the gaps with the subtext. And this is the power of story. Okay? Now, this knowledge gap approach, it's not a formula, it's not some model, some clever trick. Every story that's ever been told is made from knowledge gaps. And subtext is the knowledge that goes into the gaps. Your stories will be made from knowledge gaps. So to understand knowledge gaps is to understand story. And the craft of storytelling is the craft of working with knowledge gaps in order to create the conditions for subtext. So in the next video, we're going to go deeply into the design of a knowledge gap, what they are, how they work, and how you can use them to craft beautiful, amazing, powerful stories. I hope this is exciting for you, and I'll see you on the next one.